YouTube, and welcome to my channel. I am Benedict the 17th, and today we are talking about the Declaration of Liberalist Principles. This video will be in three parts. First, a short part detailing the rather short history of this project. Second, a much longer part describing the 7 principles of the movement. And finally, another short section that answers the question, what is a liberalist? So let's get started. On January 9th of this year, Sargon of Akkad released this video on YouTube.
My concerned subscriber is right. I had not been taking this seriously, but there are serious consequences for everyone, and we must start pushing back as a united front with a way to identify one another and assert a powerful set of values, which I believe should be centered upon the individual, their rights, and respect for their personal agency.
With this video, Sargon kicked off the movement, which so far has been focused on nailing down exactly what the values of liberalism are. Or to put it another way, what does it mean to respect a person's individuality, rights, and agency? 2 days later, Sargon posted a kind of working blueprint for liberalism. Throughout the next couple days, it went through several revisions to arrive at this final product. As this document has been revised, it, and by extension, the liberalist movement as a whole, has received numerous criticisms, perhaps the most substantial being by commentator Francois Gariepy. Sargon and others have responded to many of these criticisms, and we can use these responses to criticisms to help inform us exactly how the principles of the liberalist project ought to be interpreted. Apart from these, I will also rely on other classical liberal writers, including John Locke and Douglas Rasmussen, to help craft the lenses of interpretation I intend to use. By doing so, I think we find that liberalists represent the true inheritors of the Lockean liberal project, occupying a via media between modern-day liberals and libertarians. So let's dive into those principles. Individual rights. Protecting the rights of the individual must be the highest value of society, to foster mutual tolerance and respect towards the cultivation of the dignity of every person. The way this passage is written is a bit garbled, but it touches on something profound. Individual rights, as important as they are not good in themselves, but only in what they secure, the liberty to cultivate the dignity or self-actualization of each individual. My thoughts on this point were heavily influenced by Norms of Liberty by Douglas Rasmussen and Douglas Denial. I don't have a copy with me, or else I'd cite directly from it, but I'll put a link in the description in case anyone wants to check it out, and they should. To understand the value of individual rights, we have to understand that among all the different kinds of things, human beings are unique. With non-human things, their purpose is pretty much set in stone. For example, a chair is meant to be sat on. We judge the value of a chair by how conducive it is for sitting. A good chair is a chair you can sit in well. If you have a broken chair that you can't sit in anymore, it's a bad chair. Now, a postmodern artist could create something that looks like a chair, but isn't conducive for sitting, like this one by John Angelo Benson, and this introduces ambiguity and tension in our definition. But the entire reason it introduces this tension is because we know a chair is something made for sitting. Now, chairs are easy. Human beings are more difficult. What is the purpose of a human being? What does it mean to be a good human being? This is a more challenging question than what is the purpose of a chair. And the reason for that is that human beings possess rationality and free will. Unlike chairs, human beings are capable of making rational judgments about themselves, their own purpose, and their own conception of a good life. Oftentimes, different human beings come to different conclusions about these things. We tend to agree on vague generalities. A good life for a human being is one in which all his needs are taken care of, he has a number of healthy relationships, he has time and resources left for some luxuries, hobbies, and relaxation, and he has a good self-image. Once you get beyond that, though, people tend to disagree a lot. But something almost all of us agree on is that any conception of a good life for a human being includes some level of agency in choosing the life he has. I mean, think of someone you know or heard about that you think, Yeah, they lived a fulfilling human life. Now imagine you discovered that they only lived that way because they were forced to do so. Suddenly, it doesn't seem so fulfilling, right? We instinctively understand that the good life for a human being implies some level of free will, and this is because human beings are creatures with free will. This is where human rights come in. Human rights are the metaphorical fence around each individual, demarcating the territory in which they can use their free will to achieve the good life. That's what liberalists mean when they say that rights foster mutual tolerance and cultivate the dignity of every person. Rights don't tell us how to live a good life, they merely give us the space and ability to pursue it, whatever we might consider it to be. They set up the necessary preconditions for a human society. A strong system of human rights allows for diverse peoples with diverse ideas of what a good life is to live together while coming into minimal conflict with each other. That is why protecting the rights of the individual must be the highest value of society, because the rest of political society is built upon them. Democracy. Constitutional democracy is the best way for a free citizenry to maintain a state and resist tyranny. There are two important considerations to this question. First, what do liberalists mean by maintaining a state? And second, what do liberalists mean by constitutional democracy is the best way to do that? To understand what is meant by this point, it helps to look at a previous version of the Liberalist Manifesto, which I was able to save before it was updated. This was what it said. All legal adults must be franchised with the right to have a direct method of exerting influence over their government. This is usually a representative democracy with the state as the servant of the people, dedicated to protecting their property rights and interfering with their lives as little as possible. The first thing I want to draw out is all legal adults must be franchised with the right to have a direct method of exerting control over their government. This is important because it distinguishes the liberalist and classical liberal understanding of government from the purely libertarian view. For the classical liberal and the liberalist, government is not just a set of rules protecting human rights and a group of people tasked to enforce those rules. The political order can also be a dynamic tool to be used to organize themselves and achieve certain goals which add to the collective welfare of the society. This is what is meant by maintaining a state. It doesn't mean simply maintaining the political independence of a given people, but it also means creating the conditions whereby every individual can participate in the social and political currents of that society with dignity. And this is typically, but not always, done through democracy. Now, some libertarians might be getting nervous here, and with good reason. Democratic processes, or the will of the majority, have often led to rights violations and injustices. Recognizing that the political order is a tool that can be used to shape a society positively also means recognizing that it can do so negatively as well. Libertarians deal with this issue by defanging the government, essentially making it simply a tool for the protection of rights. There are good arguments for doing so, but this seems to be a relatively new movement within the history of liberalism. As far back as John Locke, liberalism has recognized that as long as each person's rights are secured, governments can place obligations on their citizens for the benefit of the common good and public order. I'll do a later video where I'll defend this position more thoroughly, but for now, take the example of public education. A large undereducated population with no job prospects poses a serious, consistent threat to the functioning of a state. Therefore, it is in everybody's interest for the government to ensure at least minimal education for every person in that society. Thus, it is legitimate for a government to impose taxes in order to provide for this education. In this way, other roles for the state, apart from the minimalist ones envisioned by libertarians, can be justified. Economic freedom. Property rights that begin with personal self-ownership and private property create the most productive societies. Let's begin with the first part of the statement. Property rights that begin with personal self-ownership. This is a clear allusion to the Lockean explanation for how property exits the common ownership and becomes private property. Though men as a whole own the earth, every individual man has property in his own person. This is something that nobody else has any right to. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are strictly his. So when he takes something from the state that nature has provided and left it in, he mixes his labor with it, thus joining to it something that is his own, and in that way he makes it his property. John Locke, The Second Treatise of Government. Going back to what we said before, that human beings are unique in the fact that they have the power to will their own self-actualization, it turns out that human beings are even more radically unique than that. We also have the ability to shape the world around us. In fact, our own self-actualization requires us to have some level of dominion over the natural world. After all, it's all well and good to say that my own self-actualization requires me to be a master woodcarver, but without any wood, I'm going to have a hard time doing that. But in order for us to do so, there must be a way for us to claim private ownership over things. Obviously, I personally own something when I buy it or if it's given to me as a gift. But how did the original owner from whom I bought it or who gave it to me come to own it himself? The answer John Locke gives us is that our labor, which is our own and no other person can claim a right to it, is the magic ingredient that transforms a raw resource in the state of nature into personal property. Going back to the example of the woodcarver, the tree from which his wood comes from is unowned, but when it is chopped down and transformed into a log, the person who chopped it down mixed his labor with the unowned resource and so comes to own it. The woodcarver can then buy the logs from the logger. Therefore, private property finds its origin in the mixing of an individual's labor with the commonly owned resources of nature. We also find that states in which individuals are allowed the greatest freedom in disposing of their private property as they wish tend to be the most prosperous societies. In nations with a high level of economic freedom, even the poor are able to participate in society with dignity. There are some exceptions, where extreme wealth inequalities, such as those precipitating the French Revolution, mean that even though economic freedom may exist in the abstract, the poor in society lack the resources to actually exercise it. It is in such extreme examples that liberalists recognize the importance of democracy as a way of achieving social change to avoid violent conflict. However, in general, if a state is well ordered, economic freedom and minimal political interference in the economy are conducive to the welfare of all in society. Freedom of speech. Freedom of expression is a necessary and fundamental pillar of a free society. Language is fundamental to who we are as human beings. The ability to use a developed language is a precondition for making rational economic decisions in society. One cannot have a society of mature, self-actualized human beings if those human beings are not allowed to communicate their needs, desires, and even their grievances to one another. This is because the welfare of any one individual is inextricably linked to those around him. It is for this reason that people must be allowed to speak their minds, even when what they are saying is wrong or disagreeable. Linked to this freedom is the freedom of the press and the freedom of association. Together, these freedoms provide the bedrock of a free society. Language is not just descriptive, but creative, and, when used poorly, destructive. There is perhaps a fundamental reason that John's Gospel begins with, "In the beginning was the Word." Speech has the power to create and destroy, and because people find fulfillment in their creations, we must allow them the freedom of speech. Self-reliance and blind justice. People possess agency, and should be treated as such because treating people like victims becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And each individual should be governed by the same laws as their peers, without arbitrary discrimination, and be presumed innocent until proven guilty by a fair trial. Recognizing human beings for what they are means recognizing that they are creatures with enormous power and creative potential. G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "When we really see men as they are, we do not criticize, but worship," and very rightly, for monster with mysterious eyes and miraculous thumbs, with strange dreams in his skull, and a queer tenderness for this place or that baby, is truly a wonderful and unnerving matter. The thing which is valuable and lovable in our eyes is man, the old beer-drinking, creed-making, fighting, failing, sensual, respectable man. Heretics by G.K. Chesterton. I hope everything I have said up to this point has helped show what Chesterton means by this. Man is the queerest creature, and for that the most lovely. Whether you believe that God gave humanity this quality or that it emerged through evolution, undirected from a higher power, is beside the point here. But for society to have any value at all, we must agree that human beings ought to be treated with dignity. Part of treating human beings with dignity means trusting them to look out for their own welfare. We cannot dictate a particular way of life to another person, because that would be treating him like a child. We must respect his humanity and allow him to create his own life around what he values. And therefore, we cannot shield him from the consequences of his actions. Thus, a liberalist objects to laws which are prejudiced on matters of race, sex, creed, or other distinguishing characteristics of man, because a person who supports these laws can only do so because of an ignoble condescension to a person that is superficially different than him. And this condescension is an affront to the dignity of the other. That is what is meant by self-reliance and blind justice, which at the end of the day is not really blind, because it is the only kind of justice that sees man for what he is, a creature of immense potential, worthy of our highest respect. Secularism. Everybody is free to practice their religion, or not, as long as it does not interfere with the rights of others. The state is always wary of and comes into conflict with religion, because religion is the only real threat to the authority of the state. The French and Russian revolutions may have been atheistic revolutions, but they weren't irreligious. The principles upon which the revolution leaders mounted their rebellions were imbued with the same power and authority any believer gives to a religious text. The only real rebel is the martyr, because only the man who can give up his life can show the tyrant, who has the power of life and death over him, that that power is a very small thing. The Emperor of Rome, for all his might, feared the lion. The Christian, stripped of all power, entered the Colosseum without fear. The Emperor is gone, the Christian is still here. Therefore, a successful state is one that respects the power of religious belief and does not seek to provoke it. For that reason, to the maximal degree possible, the state will allow people to practice their religion without fear of political repercussion. Nor will the state use political force to try to get their people to adopt or abandon their religion. It is for this reason that a free people does not clamor for a theocratic government, not because religion is an unimportant thing to them, but because religion is too serious a thing to be left to elected officials. Finally, it should be noted that this does not imply a total separation of church and state. The Anglican system, where a queen is also the spiritual leader of the church, is not inimical to liberalist principles. While a freedom of religion requires that religion not dictate policy, it cannot require that it not inform it. Having looked at these principles, we can now answer the question, what is a liberalist? Some, like Francois Gariepy, have argued that liberalists are contradictions. Based on his video, linked below, he seems to think it's impossible to reconcile individual rights with the traditions and privileges of certain groups, whether those groups are based on ethnicity, religion, or ideology. The mistake Jean-Francois makes is a common one to make, and that is to confuse the political order with the social order. Obviously, the government of a country influences the culture of a country and vice versa, but they are distinct. The liberalist argues for maximal political freedom for the individual, not for the individual to keep his freedom tightly bound inside of himself, but in order for the individual to give his freedom away to the culture. Man is free, not for his own sake, but so he can find self-actualization in the relationships he chooses to make with others. The government puts few obligations on the shoulders of its citizenry, not for its citizens to be lazy, but for them to make their own obligations to their community. That's why individual rights and group rights are not in contradiction with each other, because the more political rights individuals have, the more social obligations they can take on. Individual rights are not antithetical to the obligations to one's community, they are what guarantees them. That's why Sargon of Akkad and his merry band of liberalists will save Western culture, and J.F., Millennial Woes, and Richard Spencer will not. Because unlike these three, Sargon understands that the thing we love about the West is its liberty, its respect for the common man, and its culture of mischief which often flies in the face of the political order. J.F. is like the sad Parisian sociologist, busily crafting political policies while the Ottomans are at the gate. Sargon is like the happy Somerset peasant, who will turn the Moor into a Westerner by inviting him to the pub and buying him a beer. So what is a liberalist? A liberalist is first and foremost a lover of life and liberty. A liberalist is deeply rooted in his culture and loves his people, and that's why he loves all people. A liberalist believes in the good of mankind because he believes in the good of his fellow man. A liberalist may or may not believe in God, but when he looks at his neighbor, he sees an awesome creative potential which just about touches on the divine. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for listening and invite you to subscribe. If you like what I'm doing and want me to keep doing it, your patronage on Patreon will help make that happen. Until next time, I'm Benedict the 17th. Go with God.